Hey everyone, welcome back to the Veteran Teacher Files. I'm your host, the Dragon Lady, and today's episode is probably one of the most personal ones I've shared so far. So, this one's about retention, and I already know the second people hear the word, emotions start flying. Some people believe in it, some people hate it, some people think it damages confidence, some people think it saves lives academically. And honestly, before anybody jumps into the comments swinging, I need to say this first. Retention is never an easy conversation. No teacher walks into a meeting excited to tell a parent that they have to retain their child for another year. Nobody celebrates that conversation. But sometimes it matters. And this episode started because of an Instagram post that I saw last weekend. Last weekend, I saw a post of a former student next to his mom, and both of them are wearing their caps, their gowns, their stoles. Mom has a master's stole and her Louis. So both just beaming, big smiles, and mom just looks so proud beyond words to be standing next to her son and for both of them to be graduating at the same time. And so, yeah, I just sat there with this picture for a minute, smiling myself, because years ago, I had to have a very serious conversation with that mom about retaining her son. And I remember how emotional that entire process was. Now, let's fast forward to a couple days after seeing that Instagram post. I'm working with another teacher, and I overhear a conversation between her and one of our admins. And they're also having a conversation about a retention. And I know the student that they're speaking about because that student has been receiving literacy intervention and supports from me over the last few years. And because of the student being flagged, I've done some additional assessments with the student, some one-on-one assessments, and I've had conversations with this teacher, and I support her decision. So knowing the data, I don't have opinions, I don't have feelings, I have actual long-term data. And as the two of them are discussing retention, I can hear the voice of the admin. And retention nowadays is something really, really rare. And I can kind of hear the admin almost pushing back as to why this decision's being made. Have we done everything we can? Have the parents been notified? And she said, this is just something we just don't do this. And I could hear it in the teacher's voice. And that's the moment where I kind of turn around and join the conversation. Because like I said, being the literacy coordinator, I do have the data. It wasn't a formal meeting. They were just having a conversation. And I just happened to be close enough to kind of overhear it and just kind of walked into it. But yeah, retentions today are rare. Really, really rare. And schools avoid it whenever possible. There's a pressure to socially promote students. There's a pressure to move students forward with their age group. And there's a pressure to avoid the stigma attached to being held back. And I understand all of those concerns. I really do. But I also think we need to be honest about something in education. Sometimes moving a child forward when they're deeply struggling does not magically solve the problem for them. Sometimes the gap just gets wider, especially in literacy, because once a student hits the upper grades, everything becomes reading. And by upper grades, I mean like middle of third grade, fourth grade. Math becomes reading, science becomes reading, history becomes reading. And if a child is still trying to build their foundational literacy skills while also being expected to analyze grade level content, that pressure can become overwhelming. So, during this meeting, I pulled up some data. I usually have my iPad with me, so I pulled up some data and I said, yeah, look, this child has been struggling consistently and we can't pretend this is all of a sudden. And I could feel how heavy the conversation was getting. So we said, we're going to stop right here. We'll come back to it and we'll sit down and actually have a conversation. Because I could tell that in that moment, that conversation was getting out of, just a little bit bigger than the time that we had for it. Like I said, it wasn't meant to be a meeting. It was just a conversation that was happening. But I could tell that everybody involved in that conversation really cared about the student. So we needed to allow it time. And that's what makes these conversations hard. Nobody wants the child to be embarrassed. Nobody wants a family to feel defeated. But sometimes caring about a child means being honest about what they need. And while we were having this conversation, something hit me emotionally that I don't think I talk about very much, and that's the fact that I myself was retained in first grade. So yeah, I am now the literacy coordinator, and I'm the person discussing interventions and student growth, but I also repeated first grade. And I think because of that, I have a very different perspective on retention than a lot of people. Because when people hear retained, they often picture failure. But when I think about retention, I think about survival. I think about getting another chance to build a foundation before everything became harder. And I know retention is not always the right answer for every child. And I'm not saying that every struggling child should repeat a grade. Absolutely not. There are kids who need intervention support. Some need evaluations. Some need accommodations. Some need tutoring. Some need emotional support. There is no one-size-fits-all in education. But I also think we've become so afraid of retention as a concept that sometimes we stop asking whether a child is actually ready academically. And that's dangerous too. So, a few years ago, I sat in a conference with that mother that I told you about. And I remember the both of us crying because she loves her son and she was terrified. She herself was a young mom and she was terrified of what retention would mean. She was afraid of the shame that she would feel, the mom guilt, the shame her son might feel later. She was terrified that this meant that she had failed as a mom, that she had failed him. And I remember sitting there at that table with her, holding her hand, and just telling her that no, none of that was true. I truly knew that even though she was a young mom, that she was dedicated and she was smart and she was going to school and she was working, she was doing everything she could. I just knew it. We weren't friends or anything like that, but you just know these things. And I remember sharing with her that I had also been retained. And when I shared that with her, her face changed because suddenly this conversation stopped being rhetorical. Now she was talking to an educator who had lived it. And I told her sometimes another year is not a punishment. Sometimes it's support. And that conversation has stayed with me for years. Now, that mom and I stayed in contact. We stayed Instagram friends. So, not like a movie style dramatic way where we're always, best friends, but, every now and then she pops up in a story, I see a picture, and that's enough to keep me going and enough to keep me knowing what's been going on in their lives. And yeah, last weekend was graduation weekend for them. And both of them, like I said, were standing side by side, cap and gown, master stole on her, and I just remember thinking that, yeah, this is why those conversations matter. Because sometimes the decisions that feel painful in the moment end up becoming the thing that gives you, the child, the space that they need. And again, I want to be clear. Retention is not a magic fix. And it should never happen casually. Ever. But I also don't think we need to treat it like an automatic evil when a child truly needs more time to developmentally or academically survive. So, kids are human beings, not assembly line products. Some kids need more time, and that's okay. I think about how many students spend years feeling lost academically because the adults around them are afraid to make hard decisions. And I think about how powerful it is when families and educators work together honestly instead of pretending a child is fine when the data clearly shows otherwise. Because at the end of the day, the work isn't about protecting adult comfort. It's about helping kids build futures. And sometimes that means having really difficult conversations. But moments like that graduation photo remind me of why these conversations matter. Not because the path is easy, because it wasn't, but because the student made it through. And this mother, who cried in that conference years ago, is now watching him walk across the stage with her. And that's powerful. All right. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me for another episode of the Veteran Teacher Files. I'm your host, the Dragon Lady. Now, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on retentions in schools? Do you think education has become too afraid of holding students back? Or do you think retention causes more harm than good? And if you were retained yourself, how did it impact your life? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to follow, subscribe, and share. And I'll catch you guys next time on another episode of the Veteran Teacher Files.